Thank you, everyone. I'm really excited to share with you what I call the hidden hive of history, the forgotten god of the ancients. And you've probably surmised by now that that forgotten god is a bee. Well, how can that be? Excuse the pun. I mean, what if I were to tell you that of all the species of humans and all the animals and all the thousands of species of insects, there's one insect that is as revered, as universally worshipped as any other god or goddess that's ever been, and that it's a bee. Specifically, honeybee, and in particular, the queen bee. And we all sort of know that bees are dying, and I'll submit to you, there is no mystery why the bees are dying. I'll tell you later, you probably already know. But there is a conspiracy, and it's being ignored, and it's quite dire. The reason why the bee was first held in such high esteem, and like many sacred objects, I think, that are revered and symbolically significant, they started out with a really basic contribution. The bee is one of them. Societies that understood these byproducts flourished. Those who didn't perished. Honey for ritualistic, medicinal, commercial value. It was used in beer, and beer was used as money back in Egypt. Mummification, so many uses that we'll cover lots of them. Acupuncture. The Chinese introduced the technique of using the bee's stinger for acupuncture 2,000 years ago, and the Chinese just tried to employ more people by having them pollinate crops and fields. They found that it took 26 humans to do the job of one bee in terms of pollinating. And wax, the church continues to use only wax for candles with a high percentage of beeswax, and effigies. Effigies were really significant in ancient times, and they used bee wax. Propolis, this really strange regurgitated honey that is used to strengthen the immune system, and is very prevalent in all the world's sort of best hospitals. But more than anything, bees were sacred because they were role models. They were role models for society. They introduced and they spawned Freemasonry, politics, and the way we exist together in society. And we'll look at that in great detail. So we're going to go into prehistory, and prehistory is called that for a reason because nothing's written down. So forgive me if I speculate on the best evidence we have. And when I come out of prehistory, we'll be in welcome. We'll be in ancient Egypt, and we'll be out of prehistory, and things will be written down, and you'll see that there's a lot more solidified evidence for what this veneration of the sacred bee is all about. So bees over 100 million years old have been found petrified in amber, as though immortalized in their own honey, in their own secretions. And the ancients understood that, and that alone separated the bee from other insects, especially when amber was as valuable as gold in most parts of the ancient world. And honey hunting is one of the original domestic sort of hunter-gatherer activities, and you can see 15,000 years ago in a cave wall in Spain, they show a man risking life and limb to obtain honey from a precarious cliffside dwelling. And then just a couple years ago, and to this day in Nepal, honey hunting is one of the most vital parts of any society. We don't have to do it. We can buy it at Tesco. If you look back and you say, well, okay, Andy, the bee was venerated in prehistory. Show me some examples. Where's this done? It gets a little tricky. Each of these images has been recognized by a scholar as being a bee or a bee goddess. And by a bee goddess, I'm talking about a high priestess, a seer, a Sophie, a Melissa, a nymph. These are all names associated with bee goddesses. And here's one 25,000 years old. It's a mother goddess, right? But it's orange. It's laden in honey, a sign of royalty, a sign that the mother goddess is morphing into the bee goddess. Here's another example of it. But the one that I think really is most germane to our talk tonight is the dancing bee. How can that be a bee? Neolithic Spain, that is a bee. It's a bee because the bee is the only creature in the world that communicates via dance. It can fly 5 kilometers from the hive, find food, come back, dance for the rest of the bees. They can say, cheers, thanks, got it. I know where to find that food now. It's the first sort of satellite navigation. Ancients knew that. Aristotle wrote about the Waggle Dance, and I think that before his time, the ancients were aware of the fact that the bees danced. So bees were shown shamanically as dancing. This is images of bee goddesses. And one of the first giveaways is the fact that they're wearing horizontal striped skirts. Not dresses, they're skirts. Oftentimes you'll see the skirts are 6 or 7 tiered, because there are 6 or 7 tiers in the bee's abdomen, and they're alternating yellow and black in color like the bee. But in this case, the women have no head because they're off their head, because the honey in the ancient world was hallucinogenic. You go to Delphi today, and they knock down the beehives because they're afraid a tourist will walk up and try some honey and you'll be off your head. They're off their head. It's in a shamanic state. Each and every one of them, and make a note. And those are bees flying around their head. And this is also a bee goddess. Now she's not wearing that horizontal striped skirt. There are exceptions, but she does have a fish on her skirt, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. But she has this shape, and this shape is all about protection. It's a form of protection against the evil eye, as we'll see. The bee goddess is always surrounded by 2 dogs, griffins, or lions. We'll also talk about why there is a bull here. Oops. And bulls and bees are intrinsically related. And this is Marjorie at Gimbutas, who you might be familiar with. She's done a lot of work on symbolism of old Europe.
What
this
was
is
the symbol on the right hand side? Was it? No, it looks like a spill or a tadpole.
Yeah, it's related symbolically to the fish, and it has to do with protection. But I'll tell you about that later because it'll just sound too silly if I tell you now. This is 10,000 BCE. This is Australia, and in a pre-Aboriginal temple, they have a honeycomb, a hive design on the wall. Why? Well, Aboriginals understood the importance of honey hunting, and they carved it on the back of eucalyptus tree bark. And there's also ancient Aboriginals honey hunting. So Australia understood that, and Eva Crane, now deceased, but the greatest bee archaeologist in history, English woman, amazing. This is not the same image. This is Catalhoyuk, the greatest Neolithic settlement in the world that we know of. And here we have a beehive in a sacred part of this settlement. Why is there an artistic sort of beehive going on there? And right down the hall is the really famous Hall of the Bulls, reconstructed here, with a lot of horns. This shape with the horns is going to be really important and is done for a very specific reason. Also in Catalhoyuk, we have what I argue is the very first halo. This is a hunter. If you saw the full image, I really should show the full image, but it's a hunter kind of in movement. And again, in a shamanic state, look at the bees going around his head. Those are bees around his head forming a halo. And the word halo is where the word hero comes from, and the original definition of a hero is a hunter. So this is the first halo, and it's part of a hunter who's in a shamanic state. He has bees on his head. It's probably their way of saying he's tripping on some honey and he's in a shamanic state. Also in Catalhoyuk, they have the double axes, which are these axes that were supposedly used for the ritualistic slaughter of bulls. This particular double axe is from Minoan Crete. I can't find images of the double axes in Catalhoyuk, but the archaeologist reports say that, it's really weird, the double axes look like butterflies. And the double axes in Crete look like bees. So butterflies, bees, and human women are the only 3 living creatures who can produce a child without sexual union, parthenogenesis. And the ancients appear to have known that. In fact, the DNA for these people in Catalhoyuk is exactly the same as the DNA from Minoan Crete. They migrated from Turkey to Crete. And they seem to understand that, look at that. I mean, is that a double axe? It's a bee suckling a flower. And you'll look at some better examples of that. James Mellart, who did the excavation. Moving on to Malta, now sort of more recent, 3000 BCE. Malta in ancient Greek means honey, and it's where we have by far the biggest bees in the world. Gargantuan abdomens these bees have. Why do we care?
of white that Maltese cross as well.
Yeah. I mean, this is what you find on Malta. Huge goddesses. Massive, massive mother goddesses. And here you have a temple where there's niche facades where they used to put statues and... No, I just made that up. This is a honey factory. This is an apiary. 2,000 years ago, honey was that important. Look at the artistry of that design. And of course, it's the Hypogeum, the most famous temple, one of the most famous temples in the world, and certainly the most famous on Malta. And what do you have again? These images. No one ever talks about the fact that you have a beehive honeycomb thing going on in this temple. And I was on a radio program and was contacted by a woman whose husband listened to the program, and she had just been in this temple, and she's not esoteric or spiritual, according to her. And she said that she had a vision, and she never had a vision before. The vision was that there were huge women in honeycomb cells in here being fed constantly. The goal was to produce the largest possible child. It's kind of like Super Size Me, only ancient version of it. And they got too big to leave their hives, but they produced these gargantuan children. And look at what you find on Malta. The whole temple is in the shape of a goddess. It's everywhere. So this is about 3000 BC. So what happened? Oh, shoot, okay. Never change your slides on the train to the presentation. Bad idea. Because the title's a dead giveaway. But what happened 3000 BC all around the world? The flood. And so was it one flood, or was it multiple floods? It appears like it was multiple floods. It was the biblical deluge. So archaeology now tells us that the biblical deluge, the flood, wasn't like massively ancient. It was 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago. So Noah's the flood hero. And what does Noah do after 150 days at sea? He's knackered, he's wasted. He gets on dry land and he needs a drink. He plants a vineyard. The Bible says he plants a vineyard. I don't really buy that. He plants a vineyard, and they find him shortly thereafter, passed out, obliterated in his tent. He couldn't make it to his bed. The Bible actually says that. They kind of shame Noah for not making it to his bed. The ancient word for swarm is the same as the word for great. A lot of Mesopotamian words have been mistranslated into the Old Testament, for instance. So I wonder if he wasn't consuming honey. It would be much more potent. It would explain why he was shattered, couldn't make it to his bed. And I'll submit to you that the ancients were traveling with bees on these boats for a very good reason. Here's a picture of Noah. But comets are the only thing, in my mind, that could cause localized flooding. Not the only thing, one of the likely things that could have caused localized flooding all around the world. And we obviously survived this, right? We're here today. But they must have had a memory of the fact that these stones fell from heaven and caused utter destruction to life as they knew it. So they worshipped those stones. They found some of them, and they worshipped them, and they became the most significantly worshipped deity in history is a meteorite, as we'll see. So the flood, well, there's a lot of migrations around this time because everyone's had to move because their home's been washed away. But this area here in Mesopotamia, moving over to the Nile Valley, becomes the real journey that we want to look at. So we're going to take a look at dynastic Egypt. This is a picture from the Eastern Desert, which is Luxor east to the Dead Sea. I've been there. This is what you find on the rock art. And this is a picture of people dragging their boat through wherever, deserts, to get to another lake, because they're going kind of across country with their boats. But this is, I argue, a symbolic representation of protection against the evil eye, provide us with a healthy honey harvest. This is a beehive. That's a symbolic sort of ode to the bee and the bee's antennas. And I know this is sounding a bit nuts, but just bear with me. The bee itself in Egypt is from Mesopotamia, and that's well documented, and it comes to the Zagros Mountains, which Egyptologists now recognize as being the biblical Eden, the land of milk and honey, so that makes sense. But this is the Eastern Desert. It's a pretty desolate place now. Those used to be rivers. The chap who is the god of the Eastern Desert is Min, master of the wild bees. He has an erect penis and wings and plumes, all symbols of fertility and the bee. So you see these images on the rock art that were carved by the people who are making this migration, apparently from Samaria to the Nile Valley. And they draw their boats. And again, there's all kinds of beehives. There's ceramic ones, there's mud ones, there's natural ones, there's horizontal, there's vertical ones. I submit to you, these are all beehives. Protect us with our honey harvest. We'll look at many examples of this that will be much clearer. Again, this is 5,000 years ago, so bear with me. But even the animals on top of the hive are a form of protection, particularly those animals with horns, as we'll see. This is a site that I discovered. It's in a catalog now, but there's tons of them out there. A dancing goddess on a boat. So the greatest archaeologist for this sort of space has said that 75% of the depictions in art, full stop, in the ancient world show women dancing, but in pre-dynastic Egypt it's 83%. Dancing because the bee dances, because they're bee goddesses. And let's look at some examples of that. We're still in shadowy territory here. We're going to come out in a moment, and it's going to be abundantly clear just how significant this was to the Egyptians. But this is Tomb 100, now lost from history. They drew it. Now they've lost it. About 80 years ago, I think it is. And many of these boxes on the boats are actually beehives. And this is the famous Namur palette and with the red crown of Egypt. And I'll reveal to you what the red crown of Egypt and the white crown of Egypt is. And no one's ever said what I'm going to say before, so it's new stuff. The woman who's on the palette, you don't see it in this picture, is Neithahotep, which is the goddess Neat approves, or some such translation. But the goddess Neat is the greatest bee goddess in the ancient world, and she's also Athena, and we'll look at her in great detail. This was found around Mecca in a stela, and it shows a bull. Bulls and bees are intrinsically related, and we'll look and see how and why over a beehive. And this is from a very famous mace head from the middle of the First Dynasty. And again, no one's ever said this stuff before, so I'm sort of out on the limb, as it were, but this is a form of protection, as in protection against the evil eye, and these are bees. Bees are incredibly important. So just in case you think I've been making this stuff up and really taking the mickey with the symbolism, let's look at what Egyptians called their country. Land of the Bee was the name of their country, Ta-Biti, Land of the Bee. The pharaoh's title was beekeeper. He of the, hi, welcome. He of the sedge and the bee. So the sedge is a flowering water plant, and the bee, we all know what a bee is, but the bee and the water plant, they would experience this great sexual union, called pollinating. So it's a fantastic title for a king. In the king's office, in his administration in the Old Kingdom, he had sealer of the honey and overseer of the beekeepers come the Middle Kingdom. And a bee is pictured in every pharaoh's cartouche from the middle of the First Dynasty onwards. There's a picture of it. Off the bottom here is the fact that this is Hatshepsut, and Hatshepsut is actually on record as referring to her people, her constituents, as her bee people. So bees are all over Egypt. Once you see one, it's kind of like the red mini syndrome. Once you see one red mini, you think about it, you see 100 of them in the same day. Well, they're everywhere. The sedge, the flowering water plant, and the bee. That's the king's title, as well as beekeeper. Amazingly, the sort of science called art of beekeeping is fully formed 2400 BC on the temple walls. They're not only using sophisticated beekeeping techniques, which have changed hardly at all to this day, but they're blowing smoke into the hive. The salesman was blowing smoke. He was making it up. that's where the expression comes from. You're blowing smoke into the hive because you want the bees to get out of there so you can take the honey. And we'll talk about why they had to do that. And going into the 18th dynasty, this is the time of Akhenaten. You can see they're blowing smoke, and they're making these honey cakes. These are on the walls of tombs, so it's very, very sophisticated stuff. And then come the 26th dynasty, getting quite late now. It's a proverbial science, and it's changed very, very little to this day, this art of beekeeping. And this is what a bee smoker looks like today. And the thing about the bees in ancient Egypt is they were the most violent, aggressive bees anywhere in the world. And forget putting on protective clothing. You had to be naked, head shaved, and just be really cool because the bees are really, really nasty. So there's no pictures of beekeepers in Egypt, but in the British Museum, I find this stela, and to me, this is the last natural king of Egypt, 30th dynasty. But that is either a natural beehive or a honeycomb, and he's showing reverence to it because he is the bee king. He lives in the land of the bee. His title is beekeeper. There's a picture of a bee in his cartouche. I believe that the blowing of smoke is the origins of incense, and incense comes from Egypt. It uses honey, and it was a very sacred process to light it. And I think it comes from the sacred process of extracting the most vital ingredient you have in your society, which is honey. That's not Akhenaten, that's Michael Jackson, but that beeswax is used today. It was used for effigies way back when, and that was really significant. I mean, you'd make a beeswax effigy of someone and you'd do something to it. The person that effigy represented, they were scuppered. They were really, really in trouble. And there's many, many examples of that. And we've talked about the Catholic Church uses a high percentage of beeswax in all their candles. Alexander the Great, we haven't found his tomb, but we're told that he was buried in honey, and Herodotus tells us the Babylonians also buried people in honey, so it's a form of mummification. We were talking in the car earlier. One of my favorite stone circles is Stanton Drew, not far from here. And who is the god of stone circles? No one ever talks about a god or goddess associated with stone circles. You've got to be good to argue that a bee god is the god of stone circles. I'll tell you that right now. But it is. The god of circles is Ra. So of all the Egyptian gods in the world, I mean, they're really biased. They rank them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 15. They rank their gods and goddesses. Number 1, top god, is Ra. And he's the god of circles. Okay, great. Well, how come stone circles are never round? They're fantastic. They're aligned to mountaintops in the distance. They have great astrological significance and alignments. We all understand all that stuff, but how come they're not round? This is Naphtaliah, stone circle in Egypt that everyone's talking about now. Robert Bavall's written a book about it, Black Genesis. And this is what they're shaped like. More often than not, they're shaped like a tear. Why is that significant? Because Ra is the god who cries bees as tears. Cries bees as tears. Left eye is lunar and feminine, right eye is solar and masculine. He cries bees as tears. So he's the top god in all of ancient Egypt. He cries bees as tears. What do we know about his mom? Well, his mom is the goddess Neat. Lives in Sais, in a place called the House of the Bee. And Herodotus tells us it's an amazing place, an astonishing work, far surpassing all their buildings of the same kind in both extent, height, and built with stones of rare size and excellency. So it was an amazing place. And on the entrance, it said this: I am all that has been, that is, that will be. No mortal has yet been able to lift the veil that covers me. The veil. The veil. So Neat was known as the veiled goddess before Isis was. That's related to this whole bee theme, because bees are often called hymenoptera, meaning the holy of holies of a temple, or the reproductive part of a woman's body. So it all seems to kind of fit. The goddess Neat is known as Athena, who's a Greek goddess, of course. But all these really important scholars make that association. We're also told that Athena built Athens. Welcome. Athena built Atlantis, and Athena built Sais in the Egyptian delta. But then the deluge came, and the only one that survived, the only city that survived was Sais. That's why she goes back there. It's all that's left. Atlantis is gone, and Athens is gone. So if Atlantis is supposed to be 9,500 years before the time of Solon, which we'll look at in a moment, there was nothing in Athens then. What this is telling us is that Atlantis is a lot more recent than we give it credit for. So Sais is a very important place. It's the only city that survived the deluge, which is why pharaohs from the first dynasty are going there on pilgrimage. Sais is also the place where Osiris is buried, and Osiris is buried in the mansion of the bee. So these are his symbols, and I've presented this to Egyptologists recently, really tough guys, and I've said, just rip this to shreds. Come on, let me have it. And they like it, and they back it. So of all the pharaohs whose bodies have been discovered, they've never found a white crown or a red crown. There's only 2 crowns of Egypt, and we're looking at the white crown right now. They've never found one. They won't find one because it's biodegradable. It's a beehive. The beehive stands for wisdom. And the pharaoh has that crown because he's the king. He's the wisest. And that probably comes from Mesopotamia. This is the place, this is a god, Eridu, Enki, from Eridu, where the flood journey and flood heroes start out on their way to the Nile Valley. So the white crown of Egypt, no one's ever known what it was. It's a beehive. And the red crown's a bee. So the red crown of Egypt was called DSRT. Budge transcribed it as DESHRET. And the word for honeybee in the Jardite language is almost identical. And the Jardites are these weird, almost mythological people that the Mormons write about, who at the time of the Tower of Babel, which wasn't in Babylon, it was in Mesopotamia, in Eridu, traveled across ancient lands to America with bees in their boats. And that's from the Book of Mormon, which was found, some papyrus was found, and the Mormons wrote it down, then they lost the scrolls, and they wrote all these books, the Book of Mormon with this story. Then they found the scrolls in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the scrolls say nothing about what was written down that they were supposed to have said, so it's deemed to be a fraud, but what a weird thing to invent. So red crown, bee, white crown, hive. No one's ever said that before. So the only information we have at all about Atlantis, and all the books and all the presentations you've seen about Atlantis come from Sais, the place that's fixated on bees, right? And it comes because of Solon, this one of the great 7 sages, lawgiver from Greece, about 500 BC, goes to Sais in Egypt, and the priests say, look at these pillars. We're going to tell you about this great story of the civilization called Atlantis that was wiped out 9,500 years before our time. And he comes back from Egypt, and oddly enough, when he gets back to Greece, he institutes law about beekeeping. Hives have to be this far apart, can't be any closer. But eventually Plato hears about this account, and Plato writes the account that we all know about. Then 300 years later, this philosopher called Crantor says, I don't believe a word of it. I'm going to Sais. He does. They tell him the same story. He buys it, and that's that. But I'm here to tell you, I'm not buying that. But I'll tell you why in a second. But the Rosetta Stone comes from Sais, not from Rosetta. That's nearby. At one point in time, the big blocks from Sais were moved to Rosetta. So for me, that's incredible. So you have the only place in the world, and this is in the British Museum, of course, obviously, the place that has the key that unlocks the Egyptian language for us, Sais, is also the place that has the only record of Atlantis. And I think that's just amazing. So, I'm not buying Atlantis was 10,000 BC. The reason is, have you guys been to Egypt? Anyone been to Egypt? You have pillar walls, and it's the pharaoh smiting his enemy and dragging him by the hair to prison. High testosterone stuff. There's no praise and glory for some other civilization. Nowhere. And Sais is gone now, so you can't go there and verify that. But I'm pretty sure, and Egyptologists back me up on this, that those priests were talking lunar years. Each month is a year. So if you do that math, then 9,500 lunar years before the time of Solomon is 1100 BC, and that's the exact time that we're told now by science that the eruption of Thera took place and wiped out Crete, wiped out the Aegean. The Minoans were contemporaries and friends with the Egyptians, and it was only about 600 years before the time of Solomon, so it's in the realm of something you would remember. You'd write it down, oral tradition, that sort of thing. One of the things that Atlantis is said to have had is a lot of veneration of bulls. So we're going to talk about bulls a little bit. Apis in Latin means bee, spelled backwards as Sepa, meaning the great shepherd in the sky, and that's the first clue as to just how dodgy this ritual of killing bulls is, and we're going to talk about that ritual in a moment. But Taurus is Latin for bull, Apis is the genus of the honeybee, and the Apis bull was the embodiment of many ancient Greek gods. And this is where Mithraism comes in. Mithraism, the ritualistic slaughter of bulls, we know nothing about it. It's a Roman tradition, evidently. It's known for having a sacred meal and a secret handshake. What does that sound like? Herodotus says it's not any bull that's special, it's just the Apis bull. And the Apis bull has special marks between its forehead. It has these 3 dots. Well, guess what? So did the sky. What was in the sky at that time was a bull, or the ancients envisioned being in the sky. The stars formed a bull that had 3 stars in the forehead. That had been there long before the first dynasty, because 4,500 approximately is the time when Taurus came into the night sky. And you know, there was no sky TV back then. The sky was the TV, and you'd watch the night sky, and then you would try and recreate it. But we'll come on to that. The Serapeum, this is the Serapeum. It's an ancient Apis bull necropolis, and Marietta discovered it in 1851, about 200 or 300 meters from the Step Pyramid in Saqqara in Giza. And he found it because he saw horns of a bull in the ground cut off. And this philosopher in 250 BCE says, in Egypt, if you bury the ox in certain places so that only his horns project above ground, then saw them off, they say that bees come out, for the ox purifies and is resolved into bees. Specifically, the mythology in Egypt is that 1,000 bees are born out of the carcass of a bull. That's why you've killed it, because those bees become souls. And this is a Mithra temple. Again, no one knows much about what happened there besides you have a ritualistic slaughter of bulls, and bees are supposed to be born out of their carcass. So do we have any evidence that that has carried on in any form of tradition? Well, there's another interesting example of bees coming out of a large carcass. Well, in this case, it's a lion, and it's the Book of Judges and the story of Samson, who kills this lion and notices that bees are coming out of it, giving forth to the riddle, what is sweeter than honey, what is stronger than a lion. But amazingly enough, the bull rings in Spain, many of them were built over Mithras temples. So the bulls continue to be slaughtered, where they always were slaughtered. How weird is that? And all I can say is, poor bull. Because it's all because what they saw in the sky was a hunter killing a bull. That's what the ancients saw. It's not what we project. They told us that what they saw when they looked up in the night sky. So these mystery schools would say, in reverence for what's above us, let's act that out. And either they actually killed bulls in reverence for what they saw in the heavens, or over the course of time, people forgot that this was a celestial play, and they just kept killing the bulls. So as above, so below. I did a National Geographic special last summer on King Arthur. And much to National Geographic's chagrin, I argue that Arthur never existed. It's an archetype because he comes from a constellation that's called the Great Bear. His name is the Great Bear. He fought 12 battles, 12 Knights of the Round Table. And in his constellation is the Pole Star and the Big Dipper. The Pole Star turns around the Big Dipper, promising to return just like Arthur. And the first mention of Arthur is a half a sentence in the 6th century. Then you go 300 years, and there's another couple more words. And you go a couple hundred more years, and someone writes a sentence about him. A lot of people embodied that archetype, I believe, but I don't think there was a King Arthur.
Do you think it was influenced by the King Solomon story coming back to the Crusades?
Well, it could.
Archetypal.
Yeah, I mean, because that's when it becomes written about more than a word or a sentence at a time. But you go hundreds of years and no one ever says a word. And the archetype is huge. I mean, archetype of Osiris is probably the archetype of Jesus Christ, this resurrection, 3-day sort of resurrection thing goes way, way back. That's why you probably have some speakers that come in here and tell you that Christ never existed, he's just an archetype, etc., etc. Paul, who was contemporaneous, obviously, with Christ, never spoke of a historical Christ. Never. So these archetypes are really powerful. So if 1,000 bees are born out of a carcass of a bull, what's special about the number 1,000? Well, a bull's head is, when you turn it upside down, is a letter A in every ancient alphabet. The first letter is an A because it's a bull's head upside down. That's sort of a fact. But what's weird is it depicts a bull's head. Okay, fine, letter A, bull's head, got it. But it carries the value of 1,000. So it carries the value of 1,000, and it has a bull's head as the picture. The goddess Nut was the goddess of the sky, keeper of the title, she who holds 1,000 souls, and her dress sort of looks like these rows of bees, which is peculiar. And Christ, the Savior archetype of Osiris, this goes off the page here, but his name is written QRST in Hebrew, and that carries the value of 1,000. So I don't know what's significant about 1,000. I tend to think, if you do, please let me know. I think it's sort of like, that's fantastic. This is amazing. That's great. It's important. I think it's something like that. So I'm going to speculate a little bit on some symbolism. Not so sure about this one. Were Egyptian plumes inspired by the bee and the bee's antenna? Possibly. But you got to give me this one. Tutankhamun. He lives in the land of the bee. His title is beekeeper. He's a picture of a bee and it's cartoonish. His people are the bee people. If scholars believe that this is a bee goddess, that has got to be black and yellow horizontal stripes. Come on. The jet pillar. No one knows what the jet pillar is. It's associated with stability. It's being put up to the pharaoh's face during headset festivals, up to his mouth festivals, where the pharaoh's going to be celebrating his new term. And Abydos and Saqqara is where this would take place typically. It's associated with Osiris. Osiris is associated with bulls. And the jet pillar is supposed to be the backbone of Osiris. So people think that the backbone of a bull, the sacrum, is a jet pillar. And I kind of like that, but let's use Occam's razor. You have something being put up to the mouth of the pharaoh in a ritual that says, we're going to celebrate your long life, good luck in your next term, live forever, king. And when they asked the centurions 1,000 years later, 2,000 years later, in Greece, how did you live to be 100 years old? How did you do it? They all said the same thing, honey. So I think the jet pillar could be a honey dripper. Look at the similarity in the shape. Maybe just a symbolic honey dripper. It would have to be. It's like 6 feet long. So was the Sphinx a bee goddess? The Egyptologists actually like this one as well. It sounds a bit nutty, but the Sphinx had many different names according to the race of people who named it, who lived there. And it's only the Greeks who roll in the town who call it Sphinx. That comes from the Greeks. The Greeks learned everything they know about beekeeping from the Minoans. And no one knows the Minoans' language. It hasn't been deciphered yet. But we've been passed down one word, their word for bee, and their word for bee is SPHEX, which I think is really interesting. And I'm not saying the Sphinx is a bee goddess, but I'm saying the people who named it that recognize the fact that the legend is there's either 2 sphinxes, that's one legend, or there's 2 dogs on either side of the Sphinx. Remember, 2 dogs, 2 griffins, or 2 lions always protect the bee goddess. So the Greeks would have saw that sort of symbolism and said, it's a bee goddess. The mother goddess has already morphed into the bee goddess, the queen bee. And that statue we saw, the woman doing this with the fish on her skirt, that was Hecata and Artemis on either side. And the legend is that, some people actually believe the Sphinx is Anubis, the dog, and its skin is actually shown as bees. And it's a very, very ancient sort of cult, this cult of Anubis. So at the time that the Greeks have named the Sphinx, we start to see these sorts of images in the Mediterranean, which are clearly bee sphinxes. So I don't think it's really that far-fetched. So that might be a good break point. I don't know, I can keep going. Up to you.
Yeah, well, quick break.
Yeah? Cool. That was ancient Egypt, and we're going to start off with Return to the Meteorites. And this is how my book opens. I really love this story. It's just too weird, really. But in ancient Rome, there was something called the Sibylline text, which were oracle utterances written in hexameter format, i.e. honeycomb, beehive, hexameter, by a bee priestess. And whenever times got tough, the Senate would consult these oracle utterances, the Sibylline text, for guidance. And for a few hundred years, there were occurrences of meteorites falling. And so they would consult the text, and the Sibylline text would say, dedicate this holy day to that pagan god, you'll be okay. But in 205 BCE, meteorites fall big time, and Rome is losing at war big time. So they consult the Sibylline text, and the Sibylline text say, oh, this is bad, really, really bad. Now, you've got to go get the mother goddess and bring her to Rome. So they go and they get the mother goddess. The mother goddess is a real, meteorite. The mother goddess is a meteorite who lives in Turkey. Her name is Cabela. She's a goddess of bees and caves. So they go and they bring her to Rome, and there's a whole story about that because it's a bit of a catastrophe. But meteorites don't start out as black stones. They turn black once they've been in our atmosphere for a while. Keep in mind, meteorites were worshipped, I feel, because people remembered that they're what caused the upheaval, right? So they worship these stones of fate that came from the heavens. And they're black stones. And Cabela was a black stone. And I think this is where the Black Madonna comes from. It's a memory of this. But in any case, they take her stone and they put it into a temple up in Palatine Hill. And later on they give it its own temple. But the meteorites come with its own priesthood. And the priesthood dress in yellow with a big sort of hive hat, and they castrate themselves. and Rome is going nuts. There's a castration frenzy. Everyone is castrating themselves. And the Senate said, stop that. Stop mutilating yourself. You cannot castrate yourself. But on the 24th of March, the Day of the Blood, they would do that. Which is amazing. And for me, it's symbiotic of the relationship between the queen and the drone. So you have Sybil and her drone priest who castrate themselves while dressed in yellow with a hive in their head. And the drones are the only bees that have sex with the queen. The queen would never have had sex in England to date this year because she only has sex when the sun is out. When the sun's out, she goes as high as she can to the sun. Drones follow her, have sex with her. Then the rest of the bees won't let them back in the hive and they die. The drones have no stinger. And they sacrifice themselves for the queen. So I think and they look so peculiar too, really. I just think it's a strange bit of serendipity, really. Or is it? Whoops, gave that away. So that black stone disappears from history. The mother goddess, the most important stone in the ancient world, disappears from history. But about the time it disappears from history, the next, even more famous black stone appears at Mecca. The black stone at Mecca. But it's not called Kabbalah. It's called Kaaba. Pretty similar. And it's worshipped as a god today. But it was a goddess. They just changed it to a god like they do so often. And it had three names: the maiden, the mother, and the goddess of fate. What a perfect name, the goddess of fate. It's a stone that fell from the sky and just ruined your world, caused this incredible flood. 7 priestesses naked would circle it counterclockwise 7 times. And the priests were known as the sons of the old woman. And guess what the priests do? Castrate themselves. So could the bee goddess, Cabela, who was taken from Turkey to Rome, be the same stone that is today in Mecca the most important site of pilgrimage anywhere in the world today? But it's a goddess, it's not a god. So it came from Turkey, and Turkey, the Hittites knew all about beekeeping, and they had strict penalties if honey was stolen. And this is where the word Melissa comes from. It's the Hittite word for honey. Some of these slides are showing up a bit funny, I think, but that's okay. Want to kind of move on to Minoan Crete, because this is the second half of the golden age of bee veneration. The first half was Egypt. The second half really is Crete. And here you can kind of see that the scholars are saying that the hieroglyphics for the Minoan language, which we haven't deciphered, included bees, and it appears to denote royalty, and they're really important. But this is an amazing image. Again, it's a bee goddess, arms up in the air, surrounded by 2 griffins, 2 dogs, 2 lions. And we're told that many gold rings of Minoan workmanship from Crete and Greece portray the bee-headed goddess, or the same goddess, holding the bull's horns above her head. Why is she doing this? So this is Knossos. It's the center of Minoan Crete, one of the most famous palaces in the world. It was excavated by the Englishman Arthur Evans. These are one of these big vats that's as tall as I am. And the king King Minos is said to have had his son die in a vat of honey. But not one archaeologist has said these may have contained honey. I mean, this is where he lived. Olive oil and all kinds of different... it's just frustrating. But you have the Labyrinth here. And I'll submit to you, the Labyrinth is not what you think it is. You have dancing goddesses in the shamanic state. You have lots of bulls. And you have Icarus, who, of course, is the drone. He has beeswax wings. He flies too close to the sun, and they melt, and he dies. That happened on Crete. And that's me next to the horns of consecration, the bull horns you see everywhere in Crete. This shape. What does that shape mean? So an inscription found in Knossos is, "To all the gods honey, to the mistress of the labyrinth, the most honey. It's because the mistress of the labyrinth is a queen bee. The labyrinth is a beehive. The Minoans are the drug lords of the Aegean. They're growing poppies on Crete. Poppies are where opium comes from. Opium is where heroin comes from. That's really bitter. So you put honey in there to sweeten it. Guess what? The honey is hallucinogenic. They're the drug lords of the Aegean. That is where their money's coming from. No one's ever been able to figure out where their money's coming from. And I'll build on that a little bit. But this is the inscription for the mistress of the labyrinth. She has a double axe as a head. We'll see in a moment a double axe as a bee. So the mistress of the labyrinth has a bee for a head. Of course, she's the queen. To all the gods' honey. To the mistress of the labyrinth, the hive, the most honey. So this is where the bull leaping ritual would take place. And the bull leaping ritual is, well, it's just this. There's a real androgynous looking figure on either side of the bull, and someone's leaping over the bull. And it's sort of this macho kind of, the bull could kill me, but I'm going to leap over it. We see this in northern Syria and in Avaris, where the Exodus started from, but also in all the underground caves in France. You see these huge bulls carved on the walls, and you see young men kind of jumping over them. It's just a really weird piece of symbolism. But this bull is really elongated. And for me, if I'm going to argue that Crete is Atlantis, I need to solve the dilemma of the Pillars of Hercules. So either the Pillar of Hercules is Gibraltar, or it's been misunderstood and it's not relevant, or it's somewhere else. So when you look at Crete itself, for me, this elongated bull really looks like Crete. The more you look at it, it has the horns, it's not exact, but it has a lot of the same symbolism. And look where this chap is jumping, right here. That will be really important. And no one ever talks about the fact that the bull is crying. Why is the bull crying?
He's having his horns taken off.
He's having his horns taken off. And is this where taking the bull by the horns comes from? And who is that chap? Most people say it's a woman. But in mythology, the person who takes the bull by the horns in Crete and takes it back to Greece is Hercules. So if those are the pillars, the horns of Hercules, could those be the pillars of Hercules? And that's really speculative, but I just kind of wanted to toss that out there. And we know from this frame when that was painted, because that was a very limited time, limited edition frame. We know from the dating on the mainland when that was done, and that will be significant in a moment. So these horns of consecration I keep banging out about are everywhere. Look at the reconstruction of Knossos. Everywhere there's horns of consecration. It's because Knossos is a honey factory. It's a hive. It's all about producing honey, because you're the drug lords of the Aegean, and your cocktail includes hallucinogenic honey to go with your opium and heroin, and you're shipping it all across the ancient world. The evil eye, that's what you're protecting against. It's just that simple. In Greece, and they learned all their beekeeping from the Minoans, you only harvest honey at night because you're afraid of the evil eye. Honey is so important to you that you want to make sure nobody whammies you. Nobody puts a shamanic curse on you and says, you and your family are cursed. Your honey harvest is cursed. So the way to avoid that is with this shape. In journeying, horns of an animal are really good shamanic protection. And there's many, many examples of that. So this symbol of protection against the evil eye is called the sign of the horn, and we see it today in the weirdest places. I think that is, what does it mean? It's a difficult kind of thing to do. They know something we don't. So, I'm also banging out a lot about griffins, dogs, or lions protecting the bee goddess always. And by the way, I said I'd tell you what this is. She has her arms up. Again, it's another form. It's both symbolism, dual symbolism of a dancing goddess, which is a bee, and also protection against the evil eye. And if, in the ancient world, if you're wet, you're protected against the evil eye. If you're dry, you're susceptible. So the fish on her skirt makes her wet. And I think this little amoeba thing is a similar connotation. So we see this pillar here. Why do you have two lions protecting a pillar? How is a pillar a goddess? How is that important? Well, pillars are Old Saxon for Irminsuls. And Irminsuls were supposedly the Pillars of Hercules, and are the reason that some people argue Atlantis is in the north, in Germany, because that's where the Irminsuls are from. And Charlemagne thought they were really pagan and destroyed them. And most people think Irminsuls. When in doubt about symbolism, just impress your friends by saying it represents the world tree. You know, tree of life. This is me in Germany looking at an Irminsul that I think that was made as a reproduction by Karl Marie Viegut to make it look as though the Germans had an ancient Aryan past when they didn't. And so he made these. I don't want to be shameless promotion, but August I have a National Geographic special that I present about certain Nazi relics in Germany. And National Geographic just sent me an email 2 weeks ago with the name of the special, which I'm really chuffed about, because I had no idea what it was named. It was all about a cauldron they found in a lake in 2001. And is this cauldron Celtic, or is it was it made for the Nazis, and why were the Nazis so crazy about it? But they've called it the Nazi Temple of Doom. And I'm really pleased with that. But an Irminsul, the oldest definition of an Irminsul is that it's a tree trunk erected in the open air. That's a beehive. So here's an Irminsul, the tower. Here is a tree trunk erected in the open air. Biladi, and 100 years earlier, it's a beehive. You would create that in case bees swarm, they have someplace to go. And when you own the bees, in the ancient world, bees are a hive of bees are worth more than several cows. They're that important. But what I like about this is that we have these round towers all over Iberia, particularly Scotland and Ireland. They're on coastal. They're on the coast. They're not fortresses. They're not domestic. They're not. No one knows what they are. They don't fit any known sort of usage. Towers like this, we've all seen them. We're finding a lot of old coins have towers with trees in them. Excuse me. I think if this is the Irminsul, this is the protection for the Irminsul, and the Irminsul is inside of there. Because what's inside of there is a beehive and a tree and probably some flowers, protection for the bee so the bee can do its thing, so it can produce honey. And the Irminsul is simply protection. So Crete, we're talking about the fact that in Crete, they're the drug lords of the Aegean. They have statues like this everywhere. Shamanic state, look what's on her head, poppies. Again, that's where the heroin comes from, the opium. And the one side effect, and the most popular opium, is Thebian. It was really popular in Egypt, and if you take it, you go blind. So who goes blind? Akhenaten goes blind. All the priestesses in Delphi go blind, and they were called the Delphic bees. And they used to consume this honey, respectfully, in every orifice. They were off their heads, so they heard the gods talking, all right. And look at all these. I'm sure it's this slide or the next one, but all these great stories of Greek gods who go to the other world. They go to the world of the dead and they come back. Wow, they're heroes. No, I don't think so. They're tripping. They're going to the other world in a shamanic state. And look at this, 6 tears in the bee's abdomen. yellow and black, horizontal. Of course, it's not yellow and black. It's sort of checkered, but 6 tiers, and she's holding 2 snakes. So people don't call her a bee goddess; they call her a snake goddess. But the Sanskrit word for opium means snake foam. So for me, this is bee goddess symbolism with opium symbolism, which is exactly what they're doing. And there's some other images of that in other cultures in Scandinavia. So Crete's Atlantis, you have to have some really sophisticated stuff, don't you? I mean, that's what the legend is. And you have the Phatos disc that no one has figured out what that is yet. And you have all these thousands of little tiny signets and seals for special people, for royalty, for heroes. Here's one of the bull leaping ritual. Again, look, it sort of looks like a woman, doesn't it? Look at where she is on the bull. So here's one, and this is a great piece of research that's been totally forgotten. It's 1958, and they get the world's best beekeepers, and they have them look at these Minoan signets, and they're like, what do you see? Well, see, natural beehives. They don't know it, but that's a bee goddess because she's wearing the horizontal striped skirt. And they say, well, she's holding a staff, and a staff is what you used in the ancient world to bang against a hill or bang against the ground. Once the bees have started to swarm, it stops the bees from swarming. And over there are beehives stacked on each other with irminsols on them, saying, please, gods, give us a productive honey harvest. Protected by 2 lions. No one's ever offered an interpretation of this, but what do we have? Towers with trees coming out of them, with beehives in the trees. And these women who are in a shamanic state, they don't have any heads because they're off their head. They're pulling down the trees, they're taking the honey, they're putting the hives on the ground. And what do we have? A boat with a woman with that skirt. And just gave it all away. And these honey, these hives in the boat. Remember, I'm banging on about the fact that the ancients transported honey via their hives, transported bees via their hives across the ancient world. And what this looks like today is that. People extracting honey from trees today, and hives that would look more like that. But this is the Minoans' own ceramic replica of their own boat. I mean, look at that. You're shipping cocktails around the Aegean. Hallucinogenic honey, opium, and heroin. That's where you're getting your money because you're the drug lords of the Aegean. And the historians and Egyptologists, I share that with them. They like it. They're happy with that. So we're looking at Dionysus, who's the god of grapes. But again, the word for swarm is the same as the word for grape. And I wonder if there's other words that have been mistranslated. So that almost looks more like bees, so in some of the images we've just seen. Could Dionysus have been the god of honey? If he was the god of wine, then the wine would have had honey in it because it would have been mead. Just a little sort of observation. So in Minoan Crete, the beehives were wooden and had 2 poles, which sounds a lot like the Ark of the Covenant, and I'm not going to make this leap, but the god Ra, top god, whose mother lived in the house of the bee, and Ra cries bees as tears, his daughter covers the Ark of the Covenant with her wings, and the Ethiopians believe the bee once defended the throne of God. And what is the throne of God? The Ark of the Covenant. It's kind of curious. So here we have the double axe. The word for double axe is Labrys, and that's where the word labyrinth comes from. There's a labyrinth like on the floor of Chartres Cathedral or down in Rock Valley near Tintagel. That's a labyrinth. That's real. There wasn't a labyrinth in Egypt. In Huwara, that was an administration center. It wasn't a labyrinth in Knossos, I argue. It's a beehive. Look at That's kind of a scary looking double axe. Ritualistic slaughter of bulls. That one looks like a bit of a bat. Here's one in between the bull horns. Very feminine looking double axe. Looks more like a bee. Suckling a flower on top of a pole. There's so many examples. And the archaeologists recognize this as well. So if the double axe is a bee, that means Knossos is not the palace of the double axe, it's the palace of the bee. It's a honey factory because you're the drug lords of the Aegean. And Labyrinth, which means double axe, that means the labyrinth is a double axe and the double axe is a bee. So the labyrinth is a beehive. Does that kind of make sense? 1958, they made the analysis that the double axe is a stylized bee. And in Napoleon's time, Napoleon and all his court believed the fleur-de-lis was a stylized bee. For some reason, you don't always see the bee as a bee. It's stylized. Maybe it's because it's dancing, maybe because it's sacred. It's not always depicted as a bee. And here's the hive. And there's a labyrinth. And you can kind of see where over time one can be confused for the other. Patina is the lady mistress of the labyrinth. She's associated with Aten Apana. I didn't pronounce that right. But the archaeologists are happy that's a reference to Athena, who's the goddess Neat, who's a bee goddess. Her symbols are the double axe, which is a bee, the snake, which is interesting, that could be opium, and a pillar, which is saw is related to all this, all bee symbols. And look at the bee. It has this ridiculous sort of mark where the abdomen ends and the body starts, and all the women in Minoan art have these ridiculously small, not just Minoan, here's Spain. But look at this. This is a very famous fresco of a prince in Knossos. Look at the lilies. The lilies are bees. So, on Crete, which I believe was Atlantis, you have one of the greatest artifacts from the Bronze Age, the bee pendant Amalia. It's from this cemetery, and here's the ocean. And if you go straight 60 kilometers, there's, well, I'll show you in a second what's there. There's the cemetery, so-called cemetery. I broke into this, which is, the name for this is like Land of Gold. So if you go into Greece, plane spotters get put in prison in Greece. So if you're going to break into the Land of Gold, you're going to have to be a bit crazy. But that's what's there. And why would you have that in a cemetery? That's where they found the bee pendant. And if you read the archaeological accounts of what this bee pendant is, half of them say it's a wasp. None of them really explain the fact that it's regurgitated honey, and not one of them mentions that's a poppy cage. It's all about the drugs. So there's 3 kings on the island, 3 palaces, each has a king. This chap, Malia, where the disc comes from, and Knossos. 2 of them go on to become the gods in Hades who judge souls and the weight of the souls and decide who goes to heaven, who goes to hell. I think that's interesting because here's where that cemetery is. Directly due south of Thera. So right where the earthquake would have happened, tsunamis would have just pelted them. And in the past, the Minoan culture sacrificed young men, all kinds of people, killed them in blood rituals because Poseidon, the earth shaker, just annihilated their world time and time again. So Thera was not one earthquake, it was 3 over about 25 years. And we know from the dates in science when that is. And the painting of the bull with the tear falls into that date. So they would have had the first earthquake and said, oh shit, not again. So they had the painting, the bulls crying, because they know their world's about to end, and they head off in boats. And we'll see in a second the record of the fact that they said, no, this is not good. And sure enough, they were wiped out. But I think here, if you're going to put that so-called cemetery, and it's way too small for a cemetery, it's directly south of where the earthquake and the tsunami would have happened. And I think that when you look at what they use for libations to the dead, offerings to Hades, which their two almost contemporaneous kings are now in charge of, look at these things. Remember when they found the Serapeum? There were bull's horns protruding from the sand, and they cut off the bull horns. That's what those are. Look how awkward. They can't even stand up. You have to put them in a stand. And what's this yellow stuff that's shown? I think they were full of blood. And I think they made sacrifices right there to say, okay, that hurt. That tsunami, that was nasty. No more, please. So they made sacrifices, and it didn't work. So what we know is from the Homeric hymn to Delphic Apollo, that priest from Knossos got in the boat and went to Greece. And they sang songs and honey-voiced singing. And it's all about bees. The legend of Delphi is that bees made the second temple. So we'll come on to that. But basically in Greece, they took the Hittite term for Melissa and they gave it to their goddesses. A Melissa is a bee goddess. And very, very ancient. Rhea, who is the counterpart of Cabela. Demeter, there are many of them. The Greeks referred to bee souls, and there's a strong belief that souls on earth were seated by bees, and those bees were from the moon. Artemis is shown with bees on her and beehives on her, and there's also not just Melissas, but there's male bee gods. And these statues come from a very, very famous city whose ancient Bronze Age name means bee. And these coins we're finding with bees on them, and Irminsul's on the other side. Irminsul and this animal. Again, the animal it's a really ancient form of protection. We saw them on top of the images of the boats that were crossing the Egyptian desert into the Nile Valley. There's the Irminsul again. So Delphi, the most famous oracle stone in the world, come on. Beehive with crisscrossing rows of bees. That is a beehive. The priests at Delphi were called the men of the double axe. Double axe is bee, the men of the bee. And there's just example after example after example. So bees and sacred stones. A bee in Egypt means bit. That carries the numeric value in the Kabbalah of 443, which is the same number as meteorite, which is very interesting because the first full account of the Grail says that the Grail is a stone from heaven. And what's a stone from heaven? It's a meteorite. Cabela was a meteorite. The oracle stone of Delphi is, well, it's a beehive. And story of Rhea, who her husband's eating all her kids, so she takes a stone and pretends it's a kid, and he eats the stone and saves the life of Zeus, and becomes a bee man who is fed honey by nymphs in a cave. And there's a depiction of that. So this is Crete, this is Greece. These honeycomb hive shaped tombs become really, really popular. And this is one that I visited in Wewelsburg, which is the Nazi Temple of Doom from the National Geographic documentary. And Himmler constructed this underneath the North Tower in Wewelsburg in honor of the beehive-shaped tombs of Crete and Greece. But they're all over. This is Rennes-le-Château, that's Ireland. This is Africa. So these beehive huts continue to be propagated around the world. If you look in other cultures, you find, you don't even have to look that hard, that the bee is venerated in all ancient cultures. Here's the Indian culture where the bee humming was emulated in Vedic chants. chants. And this is interesting. This is the Mayan bee god. They have no bee goddess, only bee gods. They're only male. And they're the savior god, which is quite interesting. And a lot of drug sort of shamanic-induced looking scenes with bees. And although it's not a tower, it's on the coast. And this is the first place where the bee god appears, which is interesting because the round towers are on the coast and that's where the bees were kept. So if you're transporting this honey concoction, speculating here, but this could have been a port in ancient times. I find no one's ever spoken about this to my knowledge, but look at this. This is a Mayan stele. That's the bull leaping ritual. And by the way, where this person's leaping is Malia, where the bee pendant is, where they were doing the sacrifices right below Thera. That's why I was pointing that out earlier. But look at this. It's the same thing. And this chap looks an awful lot like their bee god, which is weird. Don't know what it means. I just think it's really, really interesting. A lot of boats set out from Crete because their world was about to end. One went to Greece. Did one go to South America? Was this legend brought there at the time of the destruction of Atlantis, of Thera? So, if that's 1100 BCE and Thera wipes out the Aegean and nobody can get their drugs, the Battle of Troy, no one knows too much about it, but it was about trade. And then a little bit after that, in Israel, they build a honey factory. So Israel was in fact the land of milk and honey. So their honey supply was cut off, and now they're manufacturing their own. But they just found this 2 years ago, and I think this is amazing. Look what they found: 4-horned altar, Irminsul's, with figures of naked fertility goddesses and an elaborate painted chalice, and that's for honey harvesting. It was a very superstitious and sacred ritual. Practice, and they weren't messing around. They really had to make sure they had a successful honey harvest. That kind of leads us into the early church. Jesus was known as the ethereal bee. The Essenes were known as king bees. In the Bible, the first thing Christ ate after the crucifixion was bees. Honey is mentioned 61 times. Beeswax effigies found in the Judean desert 3500 BCE. John Baptist survived on locusts and honey. And on his feast day in Wiltshire, you find a bee-shaped crop circle, which is just plain weird. You can cherry pick so many examples. Go to Vatican City in Rome, and you see statues of the popes. And they're not like a beehive-like hat, the things the popes have on their heads. They're beehives with little holes that you can enter. I mean, it's ridiculous. Bernard of Clairvaux, the first patron saint of bees. Popes use bees as their emblems and designs. And the oldest poetry in the Bible, so that makes it maybe the oldest poetry in the world, the Song of Deborah. With Deborah in Hebrew, B in Hebrew is D-B-R-E, and that's Deborah. So that means the Song of Deborah is the song of the bee. And sure enough, she's represented as a seer, a warrior princess, which is the classic sort of queen bee portrayal. And the only female judge of pre-monarch Israel in the Old Testament. So a very, very special character, and she's the only one who fits the title of the Song of Deborah. So, the sound of bees are heard during moments of state changes in consciousness. And all of these near-death experiences, apparitions, alien abductions, and yoga, people never say, I hear a buzzing sound. They say, I heard a bee. And the people who witnessed the apparitions, not the people who were having the apparitions, but all the people around them, the crowds and lords, said, we heard bees. people said, you heard some buzzing sound. No, we heard bees. So no one knows what that's about. But in Europe, the UK, I just presented recently in Glastonbury. It's the Beekeeper's Island. This is Wells Cathedral right down the road. Bees swarmed in the form of a cross right by Wells Cathedral just a couple of years ago. Britain was the Isle of Honey. Beeswax artifacts found in the Thames, 3000 BCE. And all this great sort of folk tale, which is really, really interesting. We'll come back to some of that. In France, they were really sophisticated. They knew that their country was shaped like a beehive honeycomb, and they were proud of that fact. They wrote about it. Again, we have the fleur-de-lis is really a bee, which gives new meaning to when you see it in things like cathedrals. And Breton, the dancers wear these beehive sort of hats. And during the Revolution, the beehive was a very popular symbol. What's Napoleon's nickname? The bee. The bee is everywhere in his reign, in his clothes, and in the furniture, and in the style. And why is he doing that? He's commemorating the Merovingian kings, the long-haired kings of France, excuse me, who were supposed to go back to David, the time of David, and to Jesus Christ, the same bloodline. And this is Childeric. They found 300 gold bees in his tomb. Only 2 remain. And that's what Napoleon is sort of connecting himself with, the bee. So family crest in France use the bees a lot, and the bears are the natural enemies of bees. Bears were called, in Saxon time, bee-wolves, and that's where Beowulf comes from. And Pierre Plantard, who was the last Grand Master of the Prairie Scion, had 11 bees and 2 bears in his family crest. The society that studies the Merovingians has a bee inside of a honeycomb as their symbol, and family crest with bees. Most of the time, I was going to say, it's true, most of the time it's 3 bees, and 3 bees in your tomb, painted on the coffin or on the walls, was a sign of reward for bravery for a lot of royalty in ancient Egypt. So in modern day, Adam Weishaupt created the world's greatest so-called secret society, the Illuminati. May 1st, 1776. Does that day seem important for any reason, May 1st? It's the day of Taurus, the bull. It's Labor Day, the day of the worker bee. It's also Beltane. So it's pretty famous that Weishaupt couldn't make his mind up what he wanted to call the Illuminati. It wasn't his first choice. There were a couple others. The one he really wanted was already taken, so he had to pass. He wanted to call it bees. Imagine, what would David Icke be writing about if Weishaupt had named Illuminati bees? It'd be amazing. So Freemasonry and bees. This is George Washington's apron, the Masonic regalia. You can see the beehive. It says all about observing behavior in the hive. Regular, orderly society. Those are sort of mantras of Freemasonry, and it comes from watching the altruistic behavior of bees in the hive, the drones and the worker bees, and of course the queen. And their imagery portrays that fascination. It's also the foundation of communism. And this 18th century political cartoon, English political cartoon, uses a hive to portray allegory for politics. But communism comes from this sort of, again, one for all for one, worker bee. Bees don't have brains. Bees are not supposed to. No one can figure out the fact they don't have a brain. They just intrinsically, inherently know how to do what they do, and they know what their roles are. And they don't ask any questions. They don't aspire above their station. So you can see where communism would plumb right onto that. And this is a state building in New Zealand. It's called the Beehive. One of the most famous political meetings in the past 25 years. Madeleine Albright wearing a bee brooch. But the telling of the bees is a fantastic piece of folk mythology. When someone in your family dies, you have to tell the bees right away, or they'll get worried that you're going to leave So they're going to be proactive, and they're going to leave. They're going to swarm. And I was presenting, I think it was Truth Justice Birmingham, I'm pretty sure it was. And someone told me an account, and I went back and I validated this, that in Gloucestershire, in 1976, I think it was, there was a guy who did this. Come on to those. He let the bees come on to him as a real sign of love and trust between he and his bees. So he did that, and sang to his bees every day, loved his bees. Bees loved him. Then he dies. So they were going to bury him in a funeral 2 days later, 3 days later, and it's 2 miles away. So they're putting the body in the casket, and someone says, "Stop! What? Hang on, one second. Look at that." And all the way across the field come all the bees, single file. And they circle around and they land on the casket. And people are so freaked out that somebody runs in the house and calls a journalist. Journalist comes in and reports the story. The bees stay there for quite a while. Then they go back, single file, all the way to the hive. It's amazing, telling the bees. I mean, it's really powerful stuff. Birds and bees. Birds have, there's a language of the birds. They're esoteric. Bees are clearly esoteric. So you can see where the symbolism, birds and bees being the sexual union of man and woman could come from, because they both have their own sort of esoteric symbolism. And I don't think you guys have these like we have them in the States, the spelling bees. But real serious sort of systematic, organized contest where you have to spell words. So the fact they use a bee to describe that doesn't surprise me really. Talked about Winnie the Pooh and Beowulf, but it's just a nice memory of how bears love honey. Many of our favorite beverages continue to use honey, beer and wine. Being a London guy, Fuller's is one of my favorite. And rock stars. I mean, late great Amy Winehouse, the Supremes. They have Beehive inspired hairdos. So the style is carried on to this day, but somewhere in the past 60 or 70 years, it's all changed. Bees start to get really, really demonized. They're no longer deified. I was waiting to go in to see O2 for a business meeting last summer with a colleague who came over from the States, and we were both quite nervous. It was a big meeting, and we were in the lobby and just killing time, and we weren't talking. And there was a bee on the ground, and he just lunged across the room and just killed it. And I said, "Why did you do that?" He said, I was afraid it was going to fly up and sting me. Thank you. You know, all these films about killer bees. It doesn't really work that way. Only Jerry Seinfeld has introduced some degree of levity with his film Bee Movie, which has these classic lines, bees are only in it for the honey. But in my country, the whole western region, they call it the honeybee. Thomas Jefferson is writing big treaties on bees, and the whole Mormon faith in Salt Lake City is nothing but bee symbolism. The first flag has a hive on it. But this is the weird thing I was talking about before. The Mormons staunchly believe in the Book of Mormon, which was supposedly from an Egyptian scroll that was discovered, transcribed, lost, found again. They compared the scroll with the story, and it's not remotely close. But the Jardites were these people from the time of the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel was built in reaction to the flood. I'll show you. That's why God punished them. I mean, that's just a weird sort of folk memory. That God punished them. But they built this tower to escape the flood. For the next flood, we'll just go up here. And that is in Mesopotamia. And the story is they dragged boats with bees in them across the ancient world. And we've seen those pictures now, haven't we, in Egypt? All the way to America. And thus, I ask, could this, the most iconic monument in all the United States, this big obelisk, Washington's monument, could it hold the real lost symbol? On the base of that monument, it says, holiness to the Lord, Deseret. Holiness to the Lord, the honeybee. But somehow this has been forgotten. So I think that the bee could be, in fact, the real forgotten, lost symbol and the symbol of the ancients. So in conclusion, bees are dying. We were talking about this in break. There's no mystery. They're dying because of pesticides. The pesticides make them weak. And when they're weak, their immune system is low. And like when our immune system is low, other things knock us off. In the case of the bees, it's the Vioromite that's knocking them off. If the immune system wasn't low, they would just, shrug it off their shoulders, literally. And Bayer, B-A-Y-E-R, and Monsanto are the culprits. They write the report to the EPA saying whether or not pesticides are safe. The report says they're safe. Obama stamps it. And what I wonder is, could it be a conspiracy? I hate to go to the conspiracy route, but if it's a pharmaceutical involved, there's plausible cause for motivation. The motivation is for honey substitutes, to make honey substitutes. So I wouldn't put it past them. There's two people who predicted the bee's demise. One of them is Einstein. We've never found it in his writings, but it was attributed to him long ago. So it's not like it's a trending thing. The bees are dying. Let's pretend Einstein said this. It's been attributed to him for a long time. And it says, when the bees die, man has 4 years left. Bees started to die in 2008. That puts us to 2012. Don't get me started on 2012 because I do think that's all rubbish. But it is really interesting. Of course, that's not him. Somebody just made that up, but it's a really funny drawing. But Steiner, who's just like esoteric god, bar none, he knew more about bees. He said two things. One is that it won't be until the time of Venus that man has the same consciousness as a bee. And the time of Venus in his framework is, 1,000 years from now or something. And he also said 90 years ago the bees would be dying right now. And he just nailed it. No one's talking about that. And no esoteric woo-woo reason. He said, you've changed, he was so smart, he knew so much about beekeeping, you've changed the way you're feeding the queen in the commercial beehives. And because of the way that you changed the way she's being fed, it's going to take about 80, 90 years, then they're all going to die. So, quite an interesting prophecy. So, I, for one, hope they survive. I suspect they will. What you've heard very kindly heard me ramble through is what is going to be coming in my book this year, The Hidden Hive of History. And I'm launching, I was editor-in-chief of Mindscape magazine. I'm now starting out my own magazine. It's called The Heretic. If you guys would like to write for The Heretic, let me know. It's got a lot of really big names. It's going to be for Kindle and ebook. And we're going to have a lot of really cool stuff like you've heard today in there. So for more information, andrewgough.com. Thank you very much.